The giving of charity. Question. Have you any remarks to make on the giving of charity among Sufis? Answer. One commanding principle of all Sufis, binding upon them, is secret charity. Charity takes many forms. As to monetary charity, if the money is given with a sense of joy, that joy is payment for the charity, and the good which comes to the giver is restricted to that emotion. Although this kind of giving is familiar to most people, it nevertheless remains the minor form of charity. The second part of the minor form of charity is to give in order that the person may help himself. Thus, a person might buy a tool for a carpenter so that he could earn his living. This may not be emotional, but could still be calculated charity. Its limitations make it less than true charity. Money or valuables are given by Sufis, or those who desire to be counted among them, in accordance with the principle, let your left hand not know what your right hand does. A Sufi will give before being asked, give whatever he has without counting it, give when asked, and give no emotional or calculated charity unless he can give true charity. It is meritorious to give money to a Sufi for him to distribute it. He will give it out, in large or small amounts, to those who are deserving, not necessarily in accordance with their outward need. A beggar or a poor man may get 1,000 gold pieces, not just a copper coin. Charity does not always involve money, as you know. Charity is not only given, as you call it, it is lived and performed, which means being and doing. As Sadi, the great dervish, says in his Gulistan, you who are unmoved by others' suffering are not entitled to the name of man. Charity has been made into a great virtue only because of the low level of human decency. If you still think that charity is not a necessity but a high virtue, you do not even know what your contemporaries, in your own civilization, have discovered, and which has been published in mass circulation newspapers on the subject. Here is an example of the charity of animals. Charity of the rats. Dr. J.T. Green of Georgia University took 10 white rats and trained them to obtain food pellets by pressing one of 2 levers in their cage. One lever produced fewer pellets and was hard to depress, and the rats soon found this out and ignored it, concentrating on the other. Now the experimenter wired the levers so that when the one which yielded food was pressed, a rat in the next cage received an electric shock. What did the food-seeking rats do? First, they recognized that their actions were giving their neighbor pain. Then no fewer than 8 out of 10 of them went over to the other lever, even though it was hard to work, and concentrated on it, saving their fellow from further harm. The number of readings of a book. Question. I understand that the study of books is very important. Can you say something about how Sufis feel about reading and the number of times a book is read? Answer. A Sufi book will have to be read in the ordinary way several times. If the mind of the reader is not correctly prepared, he will reject the book, read it selectively, or else indoctrinate himself with the contents. All these results are undesirable. The above facts, however, account for the effects of literature upon the minds of various people. The human mind is an organism in which what it absorbs will be to one man meat, another poison. This effect is inherent in the mind of the reader, much more than in the book. And yet people persist in considering books, in their possible effect upon people, as always the same. This stupidity is one of the less attractive legacies of mechanical scholasticism, which, indeed, usually requires a standardized mind to approach each and every book. Many people are proud of how many times they have read a book. They point to well-thumbed copies as evidence of their diligence. In some circles, indeed, a tattered Bible is still taken as an evidence of piety. And yet hardly anyone knows that the condition of the book, the treatment which it has received at the hands of the reader, will leave traces upon it, which will have an effect, just as will the typeset content, long after the impressions upon the book have been made. Borrowed books carry an imprint. Books which one has used too many times carry this imprint, this smell of infidelity, as it is called in Persian, from one reading to another. It is for this reason that people are often asked to read many times several copies of the same book, even if it means buying new copies after each second reading. This is something which may not be well known, but it is effective nevertheless. Today's refined barbarian could find in such a procedure only the suspicion that it is a device to sell him more copies of a book. It will be noticed from the foregoing material that our study methods are just as much concerned with matters of little-known fact as they are with psychological factors which people know but do not apply. This is why the curriculum of a school requires all-round attention to the needs of the teaching, the material taught, the students and the teacher. Rumi teaches of the use of books in a book, the Divan of Shams-i Tabriz, where he denounces books as a source of wisdom. They are, as in the case of the one which he is writing at that moment, instrumental. The man of God is a wise one by means of truth. The man of God is no lawyer from a book. Literary passages, teaching instruments, may need much time and various experiences before they exercise their true potential effect upon the human being. In his Ruh al-Quds, Spirit of the Holy, Ibn Arabi tells how he was taught through a quotation from the Quran given him by Abu Abdullah of Ronda in Spain. This great Sufi, who had many extrasensory abilities, chose a passage and asked Ibn Arabi what it meant. The latter did not answer him, but when the meaning came to him, he found Abu Abdullah again and told him the answer. This was 4 years later. In conventional temporal terms, therefore, this one lesson had occupied 4 years. Since we have started publishing books of Sufi tales and encounters, this kind of reaction has become more and more frequent from readers of the books, those, that is, who are not so impatient that they abandon the study as soon as it yields no immediate results of the kind which they demand of it. And, as Kalabadi says in his Taruf, patience is to be patient with patience. Question: should we not familiarize ourselves with all Rumi's work, especially as so much of it is now translated into English and other Western languages? Answer: you should note that Rumi is talking to a specific audience. How do you know which part of what he says refers to you? In the case of the extracts from the Quran which he uses so extensively, you can see that he is using them as a given, as you would use, say, mathematical formulae. That is to say, he is talking to a community which accepts these extracts as literally and figuratively true. This enables him to stress certain points and to drive home others. Dealing with a contemporary audience which either rejects these passages, or challenges them, or wants to analyze them, we cannot use them as our givens. We have instead to refer to psychological data accepted by our constituency, and this is what we do. Doing otherwise would vitiate the value of Rumi's work as a whole. He, in turn, did exactly the same thing with the materials which he built into his writings. Decline in religious influence. Question: reading Sufi writings by the classical authors seems to show that there is a clear distinction drawn between religion and obsession. Is failure to observe this distinction the cause of current religious decline? Answer: the decline in the influence of religion has been due, in the main, not to religion itself, but to the very shallowness of many practitioners. People who are indoctrinated and mistake implanted obsession for faith are themselves destroyers of the very thing which they imagine themselves called upon to try to protect. In fact, of course, they have no such call, and their capacity to protect something which is other than their imaginings makes for a comical situation. What many people call religion, which is heavily admixed with self-deception, until it discovers the difference between inculcated belief and something else which might be called real faith, remains at a primitive stage of existence and cannot really expect any serious consideration from people who are accustomed to thinking in the terms of thought outside it, terms which have long ago purged themselves of the grosser elements. Remember, sophisticated arguments and the ability to play with words do not add up to an advanced form of thought, only a cunning one. Dedicated religionists, such as we commonly meet, are, of course, no more religious than an atheist. They are crude emotionalists who happen to have adopted religion as the field of their operations. Religion is their medium of action and expression, not the basis of their behavior. In this respect, they resemble more than anything else the political, economic, or other cult enthusiasts who are a psychological and social phenomenon, not a religious one. Anyone who knows more and discusses religion with such people would be like an astronomer discussing astrology with a star worshipper. For this reason, the regeneration of religion would come from people whom we would not always readily associate with religion as we know it. This principle is well known in other fields where, for instance, great inventions come from the untechnical, since the mainline scientist and technologist has become obsessed with his field and its dogmas. Yesterday's dogmas are tomorrow's impossibilities. In traditional terms, this is the condition of looking at the chrysalis when one should look at the butterfly, and also at the whole range of development, from egg to grub to chrysalis to butterfly. I fancy, I certainly hope, that when people say, as so many do, that Christianity has not failed, it has just not ever been tried out, they mean that only the obsessionality or scholasticism has been tried. And if it has not been tried, might I inquire, when do we start? Remember, the first Persian book on Sufism, Hujwiris, says, "The worst man is the one who is imagined to be serving God, but in reality is not. The noblest is the one imagined not to be a devotee of God, who really is such." The cause of religious decline is that so few people have the opportunity of the alternative to implanted obsession, a frail thing, represented by the faith which comes through experience. The Sufi Muhammad ibn Kafif said, "Faith is believing in the heart, in the knowledge which comes from the unseen." He did not say that it was believing in something said to one or drilled into one, or admitted at moments of excitement and consequently becoming part of a fixation. Why he is still normal. There is a wry joke in the East aimed at stressing how the decline in religion is due to the ineptitude and sometimes worse of the practitioner, especially at the supposedly higher level of the activity. Like a cartoon, it is deliberately overemphasized to make the point. A spiritual teacher is saying, "My first disciple was so weak that the exercises killed him. My second drove himself mad by doing his meditations too concentratedly. My third pupil became dulled by contemplation, but the fourth is still completely normal." Someone asked, "Why is that?" "It could be," said the guru, "because he refuses to do the exercises." Why can't we have a British caracal lamb? Caracal, sometimes known as Persian lamb, is the fur of a sheep which has for ages flourished in Central Asia, notably in Afghanistan. More recently, attempts have been made to rear the caracal sheep in Southwest Africa, and their skins are marketed as Southwest African caracal. Because of nutritional and environmental factors, there is a difference. Experts and others can tell the difference between the two kinds of skin. There are many reasons why we cannot grow a caracal sheepskin in Britain, in spite of the fact that there is a demand for them. But the fact that they are brought into this country from outside does not decrease the demand. On the contrary, it probably increases it. It certainly increases the price. If anyone were to say, "Why can we not have a British caracal skin?" the foregoing remarks would probably be what he would be told by an expert. Suppose we use this example to illustrate, however partially, my remarks that something which belongs to one culture should not, in the metaphysical sphere, be imported into another. Am I not importing something from another culture, or even series of cultures? It must immediately be noted that the relevant factor here is whether the import belongs uniquely to the culture from which it is imported, or whether it does not. If I import a habit, like wearing sandals, from Greece, where it is too hot, to Greenland, where it is cold, I am doing the wrong sort of importing. If, on the other hand, I import something of use, like wool, from a place where it grows to a place where it can be used, I am probably doing something useful. It is a sad commentary on the primitive state of thinking upon this matter that people try to safeguard their existing ways by excluding things which are of use and including things which are useless. The difficulty on the part of the ordinary man to know what is useful and what is merely secondary cultural material is in part due to his impatience and greed. He wants anything that might be useful or is attractive, in part due to the fact that nobody has told him the elementary fact that certain things are not only useful but essential imports, and partly due to the fear that something brought into his life or thinking from another source might not suit him. From this point of view, in metaphysics, you will see that he is at a very low level of accomplishment, which would not be able to persist for very long in the technological sphere of a simple society, after it had once been impinged upon by a more developed one. Of course, there are time-honored ways of introducing into a society something which it needs but does not want to accept. Many of them are still being used. King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, in order to prove that the radio was not an evil thing, had to broadcast verses from the Quran so that clerics could testify that it must be a good thing, since it was assumed that the devil could not quote the Quran. There was the case of St. Francis, who in a famous story told the Pope that his ideas and organization were really ancient ones belonging to the Church, which had been neglected and concurrently developed elsewhere, and were now finding their real place. In parts of the world, it is still customary for someone who has taken a pill given to him under modern medical doctrine to take it to the local magician to have it made really potent by means of a spell. More in our own locality of operation, you may observe the almost magical rationalizing effect of an explanation, which enables the hearer to reorganize his prejudices in a seemingly orderly way. You can say to him, "I am telling you the same thing which was preached by so-and-so, and here is the correspondence of the ideas." He will feel much better. He does not primarily want truth. He wants reassurance, system, safety. Or you can do it another way. You can say, and it works, "This does not appear to be the same, but it works wonders." This can stimulate his greed, enable him to overcome prejudices in the higher interest of something extra possible for himself. Why am I describing these mechanisms, and why do I disapprove of them? For no other reason than that they are the easy, superficial way. You may say, "What I am telling you is the same as what you learned from so-and-so, and you may be telling the truth." This truth may be important, and its proper realization can have a very important effect. But once you say this truth, you may expect the hearer to use this important truth for purposes of rationalization. Instead of letting the basic truth have access to his consciousness, he exhausts its energy for him by using it to make acceptable, to superficial thinking, things about which he has had doubts. This primitive and futile use of important fact is, metaphysically speaking, the sign of an immature man or woman. This is an important point at which we part company with the more conventional psychologist. The latter, far from complaining about this mechanism of rationalization, tends to regard it as useful for integrative purposes, for example, except where it produces a state of mind at variance with social norms, particularly his own. But the psychologist, as familiar to us today, is generally dealing with what we call the false personality of man, the superficial, though necessary, intellectual emotional system with which he works. We are attempting to contact and inform the deeper individuality of the human being. How does this tie in with our Karakul Lam? Quite simply, the people who think that we are importing something, even though we prefer to say we are reintroducing it, if they are satisfied by our explanations and thus rationalize them through greed or for some other motive, are as inaccessible to what we are really saying and doing as those who disregard everything we say or do. Keeping clear of the bottom. Indeed, in a more elaborate form, their reaction is the same as the ground plan of this Mullah Nasruddin anecdote. "That is a very dangerous lake, Mullah," said a local fisherman, "and people who swim in it are always being found dead at the bottom." "That's all right, friend," said Nasruddin. "I'll keep well away from the bottom." Indeed, when this teaching is projected, as it in fact is, in another convention than the metaphysical one, the people who reject what we are saying in the metaphysical idiom often show a marked potentiality for understanding. Bear in mind here that it is only the superficial thinker who assumes that our teaching, if it is a genuine one, is bound by the limitations of so-called metaphysical vocabulary. It can be taught in any manner, but it can be taught to so-called metaphysicians only in the jargon, or some equivalents of it, which is conditioned into them already. These remarks should be absorbed because of the unacceptably narrow view unfortunately acquired by many people who try to understand psychological, religious, philosophical and metaphysical ideas. Abdul Karim Jili, the author of the important Sufi work Insani Kamil, Perfected Human Being, who died in the 15th century of the Christian era, emphasizes that being is thought, and the external aspect of being is the world. Through the multiplicity of perceived ideas and objects, of course, Sufi doctrine holds that real being may be perceived. This is the doctrine of the phenomenal is the bridge to the real, but it is instrumental in function. This means that the things of the world which conduce to higher perception have little meaning but much potential use. People look for meaning and are ignorant of use, so they value secondary worldly ideas instead of choosing them as instruments.